Welcome. We are living in times of crisis, of which the climate crisis is one. A lot of people are worried about. Look at Sunday and the Klimaatmars in Amsterdam. A lot of people came and expressed their voices about the climate crisis. How to make the world more sustainable. How to make a more energy neutral world in just a couple of decades. In this Studium Generale, we look back at the 70s, at the oil crisis, and we are going to see how governments reacted to that crisis. More importantly, we will see which lessons can be learned for now and for the future in our crisis. Together with the Green Hub, we organized this evening, and the Green Hub came up with the name of Dr. Florence Metz, our speaker today. Florence Metz is Assistant Professor of Governance at the University of Twente. She's a social and political scientist, and she's specialized in public policy and environmental questions. How can governments promote change? That's the fundamental question tonight. Please give a warm applause to Florence Metz.
Thank you very much, Hiska, for this kind introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor to be here today and to present some of my work to you. My name is Florence Metz. As has been said, I'm a political scientist by training, and I'll give you a political scientist view on the climate crisis tonight. I will talk about political solutions for the climate crisis. And let's start with the crisis that we've just been through. This time last year, the energy crisis was big in the news after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Prices for energy were spiking. And that was similar to what had happened in the 1970s after the oil price shock. Some of you may have experienced this themselves, others of you, for others, this is history. For me, this is history, and for me, it was very fascinating to dive into this part of history and to see the parallels to today. So I will talk about a couple of parallels, but I will also argue that there are fundamental differences from back then to today. Today, the question is, could the energy crisis accelerate the climate transition and help societies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Well, in fact, after the invasion of Ukraine and the price spikes, what governments have done varied widely. And that is the part that is pretty similar to what had happened in the 1970s. Back then, there was wide variation of how governments responded to the price spikes of oil back then. So why do governments respond so differently to a similar shock? Tonight, I would like to propose an explanation, a political scientist explanation to crisis. So an anecdote about the 1970s. One of the things that the Dutch government introduced was car-free Sundays for 3 months. And in the Netherlands, this was pretty popular. Other countries decided to limit sales of gas, and as you can imagine, this was less popular. We will talk today about the past, 1970s oil crisis, and what we can learn from this historic episode. We will talk also about the present. And I want to talk to you about a phenomenon that we can observe today that is pretty different from the 1970s, and that is complexity, that we have more and more policies adding up that make it quite difficult today to achieve policy success. And then I want to talk about the future of how can we move out of this complexity and propose a systems perspective. Let's start with the past, some history. And I want to introduce work that I have done with co-authors of mine, Jared Finnegan, Philip Lipsey, and Jonas Meckling. And we looked into the institutional sources of energy transitions. And we looked into the 1973 oil shock that happened after the OPEC countries launched an oil embargo towards countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The Netherlands was one of the first countries being embargoed because of the port of Rotterdam and a lot of the oil entering the European continent through Rotterdam. And after this oil embargo, prices for oil almost quadrupled. So you can imagine that this was a huge shock. And countries responded back then because they were highly dependent on oil, and not only on oil generally, but especially on imported oil. Countries like Denmark almost imported all of their primary energy supply. But also the Netherlands imported oil almost to more than 60% of their energy supply. So countries back then wanted to reduce their dependence on oil. Energy became a security concern. What is interesting to observe over time, so this is the 1960s, and the red line here is the oil price shock, is that until the shock, all countries, they had different starting points, but all countries increased their use of oil for electricity generation. And this changed then after the oil price shock. And this changed, yes, but very differently. In some countries it stagnated, other countries were very successful in reducing their dependence. And the question we are addressing is how come that there is such a variation? Back then it was a highly salient topic, and countries responded by, for example, creating the International Energy Agency in 1974. And the founding members, they were determined to reduce the dependence on oil, and all OECD member countries back then developed plans, energy plans. But while all countries developed such plans, the outcomes varied dramatically. So some countries like Sweden or Denmark, I just showed you that Denmark was highly dependent on imported oil. Well, Denmark was also a country that managed to reduce oil demand comparably much compared to other countries further down here, like the United States, Canada, Austria. And the question we are addressing is how come that there is such a variance in how countries respond to such a shock. And we argue that access to domestic resources is part of the answer, but it's not the entire story. There's also a political science aspect, namely if we look at the political systems. So then we will also find part of the answer why some countries are more successful than others. And the answer, we call this two mechanisms: insulation and compensation. So countries, we argue, are more successful in transitioning their economy if they are able to insulate or compensate. And I will explain you what this means. So what can governments do to change their energy system, or more broadly speaking, transition their economy? They can adopt two sets of policies: demand-side policies that target the consumers. And for example, these are gas taxes or carbon taxes. They increase the prices, and the idea is that consumers will then change their behavior, use less or other energy sources. Or countries can target the supply, so the firms or producers, for example, through fuel economy standards, electricity vehicle mandates, or renewable energy deployment standards. And these transitions, they create a basic challenge for governments, namely that they create winners and losers. Both sets of policies do. Supply and demand side policies impose costs on those that then consider themselves as policy losers, and they oppose those policies, tend to oppose those policies that impose cost on themselves. So we talk about the actor triangle, where there is political negotiations happening between winners, losers, and the state. And the challenge for the government is to overcome the opposition from those who bear the cost of the transition. So what governments can do to get those policy losers to stop opposing and being on board of the transition, here we argue that there are three pathways. So governments can insulate themselves from political backlash. They can compensate policy losers, or they can retreat, which means today they defer to the market. Let me explain in more detail. So this is now a lot of political science jargon. I will hopefully not lose you here, but insulation, what we mean is that governments can pursue policies that may not be very popular because they are costly and they are visible. So how can governments make sure that they nevertheless are able to adopt these policies that are unpopular? So on the demand side, we say that this has to do with electoral rules. And we differentiate two types of electoral rules. There are countries that have proportional electoral rules, meaning that different parties are part of the governments depending on how much votes they have received. And this is different to majoritarian voting systems, where there's basically two parties that compete. And the party that won most of the votes is then in power. So this majoritarian type of voting system makes it very transparent for the voter which party adopted what type of policy. And then at the next election, voters can choose the other competing party and thereby punish the government or the governing party for unpopular policies. And that is not so much the case with proportional representation. If several parties are in power, it is more difficult for the voter to punish one party. Hence, our argument is that with proportional electoral rules, it is easier for governments to adopt demand-side reforms, so those policies that put the costs on the consumers, on the demand side. And we also talk about a similar mechanism, but now on the supply side. So how is it possible for governments to put costs on companies, on firms? They oppose these costs, and they have lots of political power. So how can governments then nevertheless adopt these unpopular reforms? We argue that this is possible when governments have autonomous bureaucracies. So these are expert technocratic bodies. People work there that have long-term employment, that have expertise, and they have the capacity to negotiate with companies. And these types of settings do not exist in all countries. In the Netherlands it does, but in other countries, bureaucracies, they are more politicized. They depend on voter cycles, or presidents can override the decisions by the bureaucracies. This is the case in the US. And if you have that type of settings, then it will be much more difficult to overcome the opposition from firms, is our argument. This was insulation. We also argue that if insulation isn't possible because a country doesn't have these institutions, a country does not have an autonomous bureaucracy or proportional electoral systems, what a country can nevertheless do is pay the losers. They buy in because they get compensated for their losses. And here we argue that, for example, the welfare state allows policymakers to compensate consumers, or corporatism. Corporatism is one way of organizing how the state relates to interest groups. There's two types of this state interest group relationship. Corporatism is one, the other one is pluralism. So in a pluralist system, there's many different interest groups that represent, for example, firms, but also other interests in society, and they compete. They do this, for example, in the US and France. And if there are many competing interest groups, they also have a bit less power compared to a corporatist system, where interest groups federate into very powerful umbrella organizations, and these umbrella organizations then have a lot of political power to negotiate with the government and to, for example, negotiate deals to get compensated for costs that the suppliers may have to pay. So, now let me give you some evidence that was the theory. Now let's see if this theory also holds true if we feed some data into it. So what we did is we wanted to test whether the country's responses to the 1973 oil price shock was conditional on these political institutions that I just presented. And we used different methods. For example, case studies and network analysis. We applied this to 18 high-income democracies at the time, and the time frame was 1960 to 85. And then we tested the effect of demand-side institutions with a method called generalized synthetic control. So what this does is basically we have these 18 countries, and we divide them into groups. Those that have these institutions and those that do not. This is the counterfactual. And you can observe that before the 1970s oil crisis, these two sets of countries developed pretty similar. But after the shock, countries with proportional rules or a strong welfare state, they imposed higher gasoline taxes, so higher costs on the consumers compared to the counterfactual. And So this is largely consistent with our theory, and similarly for supply-side institutions, where we again observe that until the shock, the two groups of countries developed quite similarly. But then after the shock, countries with corporatism or autonomous bureaucracies, they had a lower oil share of electricity production. So they managed to divert away compared to the counterfactual. And if this sounds a bit theoretic, let's dive into some case studies. And let's take Germany, because this is a prime example of what is a distributive bargain. What this means is that Germany is a country that can insulate from voters. It has proportional representation, for example, and can compensate producers through bargains. And because of these supportive institutions, it did adopt transformative demand and supply side reforms. How did they look? On the demand side, high energy taxes were introduced, as well as coal and nuclear subsidies financed through duties imposed on consumers. It was called the coal penny. So on the electricity bill, a certain percentage was levied and then used to subsidize coal, which was not competitive anymore on the global market, but through these subsidies could still continue to exist, and created independence from oil for Germany. On the supply side, there were government, labor, industry coordination happening to expand nuclear and coal, and this happened through subsidies, and the subsidies were paid by the consumers. France is an example of a technocratic transition back then. So consumers were compensated, and there was bureaucratic installation. France has strong bureaucracy. Back then, even state ownership of the electricity sector, and thereby managed to transform demand and supply side policies significantly, for example, through high energy taxes. And on the supply side, France managed to implement its famous Mesmer plan, meaning that it expanded nuclear capacity from 8% in 1973 to 70% by mid-1980s. And in the UK, this is rather an example of policy retreat. So the UK lacks this institutional capacity I was talking about. The institutions that one would need to put costs on producers or consumers, the UK doesn't have. It cannot insulate or compensate. And because of that, what happened is that there were attempts to adopt policies, but they largely failed, and this then resulted in limited change in the electricity mix. So on the demand side, there was just modest increases in taxes on some fuels, but what was very important for the UK is to keep the prices of electricity low, and that's what they also managed. And on the supply side, there was sort of a back and forth. So policies were adopted in order to then be phased out again. So it created these policy reversals that made it very difficult to invest into nuclear, especially. And so what does this then translate on for the consumer? What you see here is that for the consumer in Germany, it ended up being very expensive. So the prices for household energy were much higher in Germany than, for example, in the UK or in France, because and here I want to highlight this even once more, is that costs were very salient in the UK. This is data So here we went into the archives and quoted from newspaper articles what were actors back then in the 1970s talking about. And in the UK, costs were much more salient than, for example, in Germany. In Germany, what was more important is energy security. So you see that countries have different topics that are important to them. And we argue that this has to do with the political system, because in the UK, the government is less insulated and has less capacities to compensate consumers, and therefore costs of electricity or energy are much more important. What does this all mean for today? So what this means is that liberal laggards, as the US and Australia, they lack the institutional capacities for energy transitions. They have to find other means. They cannot insulate, they cannot compensate policy losers. So they have to find other means when wanting to transition. And here there are 3 policy pathways that they can or have chosen. For example, market-driven transitions. So yeah, this means that as soon as technologies are ripe, are cheap enough, these countries can invest in solar or wind because these are competitive. But we all have experienced that young, new technologies, they are not competitive on the market. So this market approach relies on other countries, that first invest into new technologies, make them cheap, and only then countries like the US can jump in and adopt solar or wind. For example, Texas is a huge adopter of wind because they have wind, but this is because the technology by now is competitive. And for example, for solar, Germany was one of the countries that through its feed-in tariffs invested in this technology and made this technology cheaper for the entire world, including the US. And then countries like the US can invest and use the market to deploy solar. What countries like the US can do is they can adopt policies that are less visible, so the costs for the policies are less visible. This is, for example, R&D policies, government procurement, and this is what governments have done. And countries like the US, they are not monolithic. Of course, there are pockets of insulation that they can use. And California, for example, is a state within the United States that has adopted quite ambitious climate policy. And this is because the Californian legislature, the parliament there, delegated decision-making to a technocratic body. And this technocratic body, it's called the California Air Resources Board, is highly insulated from voters. Politicians can even blame this board and say, it's not our fault, it's this board. And this is then how ambitious climate policies have been adopted in California. I've now been talking about the past, but I don't want to end with the past. I want to talk about today. So climate policy today, similar to what has happened in the past, varies from country to country. What you see here is an index. It's called the Climate Change Performance Index, which is based on greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy use, and climate policy. And it shows that based on these indicators, what countries have done varies quite dramatically. And so this is similar to the 1970s. Countries chose their own policy pathway. They have their own way of doing things. And what is similar as well is the fundamental political challenge. That is that transitions create winners and losers. And the losers, they protest against policies that will impose costs. here producers in the Netherlands, we have experienced the farmers that go to the street. Or a couple of years before that, the Gilets jaunes in France. These protests, they were protesting against fuel taxes, and the fuel tax has been promoted as one of the policy instruments that will make sure that consumers stop, for example, taking their cars. But the problem is that this fuel tax, we call it, is regressive. So it puts higher costs on poorer parts of the population. So people that live outside of the city, they are often dependent on their cars to commute to work. And if then the fuel taxes rise, they have to pay higher prices when fueling their cars. And they don't necessarily have the alternatives, but because where they live typically is not so well connected to public transport. So that's what it's called, that the fuel tax is regressive. And so people go to the street, and in France they were successful. The fuel tax was taken down by the government. So these are the historic parallels between 1970 and today. But there are also fundamental differences. The world is changing, it's becoming hotter, drier, and wetter at the same time. And so with these changes, fundamental changes, I want to draw your attention to a paradox, namely that governments respond to the climate crisis by adopting more and more climate-related policies. This is data from the European Union based on a data set from climate change laws of the world. And it shows that over time the European Union adopted more and more policies. Yet, if we believe the projections of the Climate Action Tracker, the EU is still going to miss its goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050. And that is pretty frustrating. The governments do more and more, and yet they still fail to reach their targets. The question is why? And here I want to propose an explanation. These policies, they don't necessarily add up coherently. It is our assumption that you add more policies and this will improve the situation. But these policies also often cancel each other out. And this is one of the effects that has been overlooked, and I want to talk to you about today, because it is something that makes today's world fundamentally different from the 1970s. Why is this so? In the 1970s, policy complexity was still was not the same level as today. Over time, policies have accumulated, so this is environmental policies, but this would also relate to other policy sectors. So this is environmental policies across countries, OECD countries, and over time, and you see a consistent trend that more and more policies, policy goals and policy instruments to achieve those goals are being adopted. And this makes it, of course, quite complex for policymakers to also implement these policies. What the European Union has done is to require climate change policy goals to be integrated into sectoral policies. With the 2021 EU climate law, climate neutrality became legally binding, and the EU budget for climate spending for the 21-27 period is targeted at 30%, or 575 billion euros. And it means that all sectors, so across the economic, social, and environmental sectors, are required to consider climate goals. More concretely, there is a climate consistency mechanism. So what this means is that every new policy proposal in the European Union has to be consistent with a net zero goal. So this to the goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050. So there's a check that this is the case, and the goal is to have this for future, but also for past policies. And this is a very good idea because of incoherences. So I want to give you a very concrete example of policy incoherences. So this problem that we observe today and maybe was less prevalent in the 1970s. An example from air pollution. So the European Union has the Ambient Air Quality Directive, and this directive sets NO2 concentration limits to make sure that NO2 is less emitted into the air. At the same time, we have the Energy Taxation Directive, and it sets minimal tax rates for diesel cars. So diesel cars are taxed lower than petrol cars. And this sets, of course, an incentive for consumers to buy diesel cars if they are cheaper. But these diesel cars, they emit NO2, so the same pollutant that is regulated in another directive. And so what I'm trying to tell you with this example is that it exists in every political system, also on the EU level, that policies are not necessarily coherent to one another. And I argue that this is on a more general level if this happens a lot. So if we often have policies that contradict each other, we end up with many contradictory policy, and this makes then implementing those policies pretty hard. I want to now show you, I want to now explain this phenomenon by theorizing about it, give you a bit of evidence, so data, and I will give you some data from Switzerland and flood risk management policy because I was working in Switzerland before, but I argue that this phenomenon is relevant beyond this specific case, and then tell you about a couple of consequences of this complexity. This is work that I've done with my collaborators, Stefano Rat and Thomas Bolognesi, and we call this phenomenon the institutional complexity trap. And we've theorized about this, and what we say is that policies, they have two stages. In the first stage, more and more policies are being adopted, and so the number of policies increase linearly, but their interdependencies, they grow exponentially. And at some point, a tipping point is reached, after which adding more policies does not improve the situation, but it impairs it, because the incoherences prevail. And we have tested this hypothesis, and what we see is then when we look at flood risk policies in Switzerland over 160 years, that there's more and more policies being adopted, and their interdependencies, at first they don't grow a lot, but at some point the interdependencies, they take over and grow even exponentially. And what is interesting here is that we often live in this sort of setting, in this sort of thinking, where we think if we adopt more policies that this will solve problems, but we are really today in this type of world where we already have so many policies that adding yet another policy will have multiple interdependencies with pre-existing ones. And so this is data, real data, where we looked into flood risk management policies until 1990, 2000 and 2010, and the red ties are the newly created interdependencies, and I think it shows quite nicely that the more policies exist, the more interdependencies are created with each added policy. But of course, policies are also reformed or replaced or even abandoned. We argue that these, what we call reform cycles, coherence cycles, that they are not enough to override the general trend, long-term trend towards a complexity trap. And we can show this that if we account for reforms, this flattens the curve a little bit, but it cannot override the general trend. What are the consequences of such policy complexities? Well, it creates legal uncertainties and makes policymakers' work increasingly complicated. It creates implementation deficits, and that frustrates people. It also increases transaction costs for policy coordination, because if there are so many policies in place, one needs to coordinate with lots of different actors. And it also makes evidence-based policy making difficult, because which policies are then having which effects is difficult to evaluate, but these evaluations are important for evidence-based policy making. So if this is such a big problem, then it is also important to find ways to get out of this complexity trap. And in this theory, we have argued that the complexity trap prevails in the long term. However, I also want to share thoughts about how we can overcome this problem. And one can also take a bit of a different perspective here. One can think of this problem also in a way that we have in a policy regime where we have different sectors, transport, housing, electricity, that these compete with one another for modernization. And it gives, if we have these regimes, then they enable change in those sectors where change is possible. And then where change is possible, this will probably then entrain change also in other sectors. And then incoherences are also sometimes created deliberately to break with an existing paradigm. Let me show you an example from the European Union again. So the European Union banned combustion engine car from being sold by 2035. Now, with introducing this policy, this is a modernization, a reform, you could say, towards the climate goal. But this policy also created many incoherences towards existing ones, because this electrification of transport does not make sense if the energy sourced is not renewably sourced. So what the European Union was in the process of doing is to reform the Renewable Energy Directive. The new version that is has been adopted in 2023 foresees now a much more ambitious renewable energy goal, namely 42.5% renewable energy in the European Union by 2030. This electrification of transport also necessitates an infrastructure. You have to fuel your car with electricity on the road, and at the moment this infrastructure is still lagging behind, and because of that the European Union is in the process of reforming its alternative fuels infrastructure directive. But until the time that this is reformed, there are still these incoherences happening. And similarly, fueling does not only take place at home, but also not only on the road, but also at home. So the European Union is in the process of reforming the Energy Performance of Building Directive to make sure that fueling is also possible at home. But as long as this is being reformed, there are incoherences in the policy regime. And last but not least, I want to give you a new perspective to look into these processes. So the complexity trap should not be misunderstood as a plea for deregulation. We need reforms, we need policy reforms to modernize our societies and to go into a new era of sustainable development, of climate policy, of sustainability. But what we can look at this is that if in our societies we have competing paradigms, it was welfare and planning after the Second World War. Then it was neoliberalism in the 1990s. And today's policies are largely consisting with this neoliberal paradigm. Today, the new paradigm may be net zero or sustainability. But every time a new policy is introduced, it creates this incoherences towards, so a new policy that is consistent with a sustainable development agenda creates incoherences towards pre-existing policies that are consistent with a neoliberal paradigm, economic growth. But the more policies are being reformed, at some point a tipping point is reached and a new equilibrium is created where sustainable development is maybe the overarching paradigm. I still have 15 minutes, is that right? Yes. Yeah, okay. So I've looked with you into the past, into the present, giving you some examples from the European Union, and now would like to look a little bit into the future. And here I would like to look into the Sustainable Development Agenda and a paper that I have worked on together with my collaborators. And what we wanted to know is whether, if we take a holistic view, whether we could find some what we call multipliers and virtuous cycles. I will tell you in a minute what this means. Until now I've been talking about climate and energy, but if we really want to move towards a more sustainable world, we have to look at the economy, the environment and society holistically. And here the Sustainable Development Agenda is what has been formulated that looks, it's meant as an indivisible agenda. It formulates 17 SDGs that span the economic, social and environmental domains. Researchers oftentimes, they say, oh, I'm working on SDG number 7, energy, or SDG number 6, water. But if we take this agenda seriously, the idea is to look at all the 17 SDGs and as an indivisible agenda. At the same time, for policymakers, it is difficult to do everything at the same time. You cannot reform everything at the same time. So together with my co-authors, I was thinking about smart ways of prioritizing policy action. And what we did is we looked at the interdependencies between SDGs on a global scale with a systematic literature review. So what do we know in the literature? How do SDGs interact? In a positive way, positive means that they are synergistic, they reinforce one another, and negative means that they contradict each other, they weaken each other. And here you find our data, if you want. So these are the 17 SDGs. And blue means that an SDG impacts another one in a positive way, and red means that there is a negative interactions. And the bigger the circle, the more interactions are reported in the literature. Sorry. What we have found is some as interactions that are particularly prevalent. And prevalent here means that there is a lot being written about it. It doesn't mean that this is only the thing that exists out there, but it definitely means that this is what we pay attention to. And we pay attention to renewable energy. Renewable energy has a lot of interactions with other SDGs, positive and negative ones, especially with water, poverty, health, growth, and food. What is also interesting to notice are the positive interdependencies. So an SDG that impacts others in a positive way. And here, the good news first is that if we look at it in its totality, the positive interactions, so all the interactions that we have recognized here, positive ones outweigh the negative ones. That's good to know. But there are still some that I would like to highlight specifically. So this is SDG 15, this is land, which impacts food production in a positive way. That is pretty intuitive. But if we look at the reverse interaction, it is the case that food does impact land partly also in a negative way. Then something that is interesting to highlight is that the SDG that has only positive interactions towards others is gender. And now to the negative SDG interaction. So what we can see is the water, energy, food nexus. This is energy impacts water also here in a negative way. Food impacts water in a negative way, for example. What we also see is that food and energy generates 50% of the negative interactions, and the most negatively impacted goals relate to natural resources. So this is water, oceans, and land. Now, what we did with that type of data, we came up with a topology. So remember, we came up with this data set with the idea that we want to prioritize policy actions. We can't do everything at the same time, so is it possible to strengthen some of these SDGs such that it will have a positive effect on all the others at the same time? And we came up with a typology of multipliers and buffers. So a multiplier is an SDG that has few incoming but many outcoming ties, so it impacts others more than it is impacted. A buffer is an SDG that has is being influenced by many other SDGs but influences other SDGs only little. And what is then important to find is this multiplier of positive and buffer of negative interactions. So this is an SDG that impacts other SDGs a lot, but only in a positive way. And if it is impacted by others in a negative way, it will buffer it. So you have to imagine, to give you an example, a prime example of such a multiplier of positive and buffer of negative interactions, water or education. So if we invest reform capacity, our data would say that we should invest it in clean water and sanitation because this would strengthen the entire SDG agenda. It will impact other SDGs in a positive way and buffer negative interdependencies. So this is a system-level approach. It is a potential solution to this policy complexity trap that I was talking about earlier. We have more and more policies today. I also said that deregulation isn't entirely the solution because we need these policies to move towards modernization. But what we could do is to have targeted reforms to make sure that these policies, that they work towards one another in a synergistic way, that they reinforce one another and don't cancel each other's effects out, like the example from NO2 emissions that I gave you. And so the idea would be to build on targeted interventions that minimize incoherences and maximize synergies. So this would mean that we have this type of, that we identify policies that are multipliers and start here with reforms. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your inputs.
Thank you very much, Florence. That was a lot to digest. It was beautiful theory, and it really gave an insight in how policy making is working. But let's make it a little bit more down to earth. Before I give you room for questions, I would like to ask something about what you call the institutional complexity traps theory, meaning a number of policies, the number of policies is increasing, but the interdependencies are growing, so that there is a rising incoherence between all those policies, and they don't work effectively and efficiently anymore. But then you say you have that period with incoherences and policies not working like they should work, and then a new transition takes place, and then you have a new balance. If I correct me if I'm wrong, but I would summarize it like that. But the phase in between, the phase in which everything is incoherent and is not working anymore, I was wondering if the public opinion, if the people don't get frustrated, because there are a lot of policies, they have to maintain those policies. For example, the farmers in the Netherlands with their nitrogen output, they were really angry, and they all went with their tractors to Den Haag to protest against it. What about that period of time? Is it not dangerous for democracies, or are they resilient enough? I know it's a difficult question because you are a scientist, but can you tell something about that period?
Yeah, that is a very good question. You know, my chair is called Governance Resilience.
Yes.
And this is exactly the core questions. You know, our democracy is resilient enough to resist this the difficult times. There's different types of difficult times, but one certainly are these transitions, because they create incoherences, they create protests, frustration, and they are sensitive times, definitely. If then on top of it other things happen, like a war, like inflation, this can create quite some destabilization and difficult times, definitely. This is the hope that our democracies will be resilient enough. Is this also the case? I don't know yet.
If you look at the Netherlands,
Yeah.
do you think the Netherlands are resilient enough? Because, for example, the climate march we had in Amsterdam on Sunday, last Sunday, it was about the climate, but there were also protests, even by Greta Thunberg, about the war between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we are definitely experiencing a time where different things come together at the same time. But maybe it is helpful here to look back into the 1970s, where similar things were on the agenda, and back then the prices were spiking, and people were also, insecure about how to deal with this situation. And war happened, etc. But and back then our democracies were very resilient. They managed to resist and transition away from oil. Some, as I showed, some countries more successful than others. So yeah, I think it is. I look into this as a phase of transition that will bring us towards a new era where there's a new equilibrium that is hopefully a more sustainable world. But there are, of course, there are competing forces. You know, you can look at this. I look at this very positively and optimistically. But you could also say, we know about climate change for so long, and there have been successful forces trying to make sure that reforms are being delayed, and these have also been successful. So it's always a struggle in democracies between change and stability.
Okay. And one other thing about the 70s and the times we are living in right now, you showed some policies in Germany, in the UK, and in France. But I think now we have more policies made in Brussels, made by the European Union, or isn't that the case? Is it still the nationalistic, the governments of the different countries making policies, or are they more working together?
Well, both is happening at the same time, right? So the European Union is, and I like to say that it is the member states together are the European Union, right? So
that's correct.
The member states together on the European level decide for targets, and then the implementation happens on the member states level. So the member states play a key role in making it happen, making transitions happen. So yeah, the member states are very important today.
Okay. I was walking away from you, not because I don't want to be here in the center of the room, but because I want to grab the mic and ask you if you have questions to Florence. Okay, over here.
My compliments for the complexity of your whole study. But my question is there an inevitability to your conclusions? So we are heading towards chaos or a certain positivity, or is there some proper advice resulting from your study that says we should go this direction and not that direction? Because that's what I want to know.
I think the advice that we can take from the data that I have analyzed is to acknowledge that countries take different roads. And there's not just one road to Rome. So, but as long as countries adopt policies, there can be some sort of change. There's one lesson that I would take away. The other lesson to take away is, yes, there's this complexities, more policies adding up. It is a risk, but I like to look at this a bit differently, that this is a normal evolution, a process of modernization where there is competing paradigms that cannot be managed away, but they tip over time. Tip over time means that we're in a process of reforming policies, maybe towards a new paradigm, sustainability. And in this process, there is a bit of chaos, but it will eventually end up in a new equilibrium. And this is a normal evolutionary process.
I was wondering, when a new policy is implemented, would it be possible to first use artificial intelligence to see if, okay, this new policy is introduced, with what other policies interacted with, which one does, and before it is really implemented in the, in politics.
Yeah. So
Would that work?
This is an excellent comment, because this is a project that I have been proposing, and I haven't been successful so far in making it funded, because the argument is that these interdependencies, they are very contextual. So if one policy has the goal to reduce NO2 emissions, and the other is a tax policy, to train a machine to learn that these causally relate is very difficult, because it is already difficult for us humans to understand that these fundamentally different policies, that they relate in the real world. So what I'm trying to do is to do it similarly to this SDG work, where we use the literature, our body of knowledge on these dependencies, and to use this body of knowledge to train a machine to learn about these interdependencies, and potentially turn this into a policy tool that could advise the European Union on, okay, we have this new policy, this is our draft, with what other existing policy would this interact. That's the idea. We are far away from this yet.
Okay.
Maybe to give you like a bit of a background, the new European climate law was adopted in 2021. Article 6 of it introduces a consistency mechanism, meaning that the European Commission is obliged to check if every new proposal is consistent with the 2050 net zero goal. But the European Commission does not yet have a method or an idea of how to make these checks. So why not use artificial intelligence? It seems intuitive, but it is not existing yet.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about whether you could give another example of maybe a national context in which there was a problem, voters wanted change, the politicians came together, they thought of a great solution, and then because of these interconnectedness between the policies, the net effect of their policy was actually negative. So we would like to reduce carbon emissions, we implement a policy, but carbon emissions actually went up from the cases that you analyzed for your work.
Yeah. So I have many examples that are not about carbon emissions, but what happens oftentimes is that policy decisions are taken in sectors. So if you look at how our state is organized, there is the Ministry for Environment, there is the Ministry for Transport, etc., etc., and these are responsible for policy making. They take sectoral decisions, oftentimes that maybe they try to coordinate with others, but essentially they have to come up with their own reform. And this then creates incoherences towards others. For example, when Fukushima happened, this created a window of opportunity to phase out nuclear, and some countries did, like Germany or Switzerland. Others did not, France or Japan itself. And while this seemed like a good idea for, let's say, in the environmental movement, this is not necessarily so coherent with this idea of achieving net zero goal, because nuclear is a CO2 neutral policy. So later on, the European Union, in the framework of the European Green Deal, declared nuclear as a green technology. Maybe this is an example of like incoherences, different views of seeing the same things, also decisions taken in different sectors and at different times that are then not necessarily coherent towards one another.
Yes, thank you. How comparable do you think that the oil crisis of the 70s is with the issue of climate change? Because to me it seems like that was more issue that need to be solved at a national level, where there's a lot of global complexity with climate change, where the countries that pollute the most are not necessarily the most affected by the impacts, and also where there are many developing countries which may not necessarily have the same interest and priorities in solving climate change, but for example, first improving their economy.
Yeah.
What's your
Yeah, I
take
think
on
you're
that?
very right. I've tried to highlight that there are some parallels. So there are shocks, and countries respond to these shocks with different policy solutions. And I think this is a parallel. Also, the fact that political systems may matter, and that winners and losers exist back then and today. But I also tried to highlight that there are substantial differences between the world in the 1970s and today's world. And I highlighted that policy accumulated today, but I could also have talked about globalization and the interdependencies of different countries. I think you're very right that this increases complexity as well. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question specifically about one chart about Switzerland,
Yeah.
where there was a very steep curve for the interdependencies. And I was wondering, do you know the reason of that steep rise in the chart? And is it explained, and is it necessarily a bad thing? Because I don't really know how, but I could imagine that maybe it was on purpose that at one moment, because it's so steep, someone decided we need to make a new policy that takes into account all the other policies. Or do you have another explanation of why there's such a steep rise at once in Switzerland? And yeah, is that always a negative thing?
So in our theory, we argue that this is a mechanism that happens as policy portfolios grow. It is an effect that whenever a new policy is introduced, this new policy can theoretically interact with all the pre-existing ones, right? And so you do I have so here the number of ties with just 3 policy instruments is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this is all the interdependencies that can exist. But the potential increases the more policies exist. Is not just a linear increase in the number of possible interdependencies, but this is an exponential growth of potential interdependencies. Not all of them materialize, but even if it's just a fraction, this is quite a bit just in theory. So this is just a mechanism. The more policies exist, the more interdependencies can exist. Does that make sense? This is a network phenomenon, if you want so.
Yeah, so I understand the sort of mathematical
Yeah.
reason, but I think it was one slide.
Yeah. So here we simply quantified. So we counted the number of policies. This is basically the nodes in this tie graph, and the ties is the dark blue line.
So it's nothing on purpose. It's just the exponential growth of the number of policies. That's the only influence for this chart.
Yeah. So the number of policies is the light blue, and then their interdependencies, they grow at some point exponentially. And the interesting thing is that the interdependencies, they lag behind. So first they are less, and then at some point they really take off and grow more rapidly than the number of policies. because each added policy can interact with multiple pre-existing ones.
And can you determine when the tipping point will be, or is it just, it happens?
I think you could theoretically determine it, yeah.
Okay, okay, that's hopeful. Here you are.
Thank you. So, in the beginning of your speech, you were actually giving some indicators for governments who can take bold actions and ones which cannot, because you are sort of resistant to the losers who will protest.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, you have the EU now, and so is the EU as a body a sort of independent bureaucracy? You can always blame Brussels that they did it. And is that actually helping those countries who do not have these institutions by themselves?
Yeah. This is an excellent analysis of the situation. It's a very good analogy. Yeah, exactly. This is very much how one could see is that Brussels is pretty much insulated. And with the European Green Deal, put forward a very ambitious package that would not be possible in some of the member states, definitely. But also then Brussels takes the blame for it. And yeah, this has positive and negative effects, as you know, yeah.
Hey, thank you very much. I learned a lot today. I myself research also carbon neutrality, and I'm particularly interested in the building sector. And I was wondering, in relation to some things that I learned today, in relation to who do we insulate from and whom do we compensate? And also in the end, you mentioned something in relation to lobbying. I'm from Germany. In terms of insulation, really insulation of buildings, there in the German law, like property owners get an interest-free loan to insulate their houses, while renters, like housing companies, they are like incentivized to insulate their home through rent increases. And these are like permanent. So renters also subsidize that property owners get increased rents. And so this is also an example of a regressive measure to get this insulation. And I think it's like the same with the subsidy for electricity that you mentioned that financed solar power and so on, because renters had to pay increased prices for electricity. Industry was exempted from it, like energy-intensive industry, and also homeowners in like mostly in the affluent southern Germany, they put solar panels on their roofs and got feed-in tariff prices that was subsidized by renters. And when I visited the Ministry of Economy and Energy, there with a member of the Green Party, she said to me that that ministry is very, very neoliberally influenced, and that there's limited impacts of policymakers to change that. So I was wondering, like, how lobbying affects these like distributive aspects of these policies, and how ecological and social goals can then be in conflict. And if you have, yeah, sorry, this is also maybe just too much input, but yeah.
This is, we could write a paper about your question, but I mean, basically it is a very sharp observation, and what you did is an application of our theory to many different policy fields in Germany. And you just described the German style of a distributive bargaining that we call, where you put costs on the consumers. As you can see here in the 1970s, they already did this. The prices for electricity for consumers were much higher in Germany than for others, because Germany was able to put this cost on the consumers, and then they were also compensated to the welfare state on the other hand. And then also a German thing is this bargains, distributive bargains. We have in Germany there's corporatism, meaning that lobby groups, they create this umbrella organization, and the umbrella organization then bargains with the government and has quite some power to negotiate deals that are advantages to them, but also for the government advantages because they get the buy-in of these firms or sectors. So I'm just reiterating all the examples that you show is very typical for what we're trying to explain with these mechanisms, these two. So you basically described insulation and compensation in the German case.
More questions? Yes?
I have a simple question. I don't understand what the policy gender is. Can you explain about that?
The climate policy, you mean?
Yeah, you mentioned gender as a beneficial. It has all nice influences on other companies, but what is it? What is the policy gender?
The question, so if we are in a climate world or in a world of more sustainable development, then and if we have this thinking that social, economic, and environmental aspects, they all have to be strengthened. My argument was, yeah, but this is difficult to do all at the same time. So in this article, we tried to figure out, can we prioritize policy action? Where to start? Because doing all the 17 SDGs and reforming them at the same time is difficult. And so we looked into the interactions and wanted to know, is there one place, if we target that this will have a positive influence on everything else, on the entire SDG agenda. And we found that, for example, gender is not such a bad place to start off with, because if you strengthen the status of women in society, this will have a positive influence on children, on the education of children, on the health of children, which will reduce poverty, etc., etc. And then with reduced poverty, their environmental goals are more important. The economy increases, etc., etc. So it has this multiplier effect.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's all connected.
Good evening. And my question is about interdependencies. Is the problem the number of policies, or the fact that they are made one after the other in different moments, so they're trying to achieve different goals? And so do we need all these policies, or can we cut them down and start from scratch? And in that case, will we still have interdependencies?
Mm-hmm.
So what colleagues of mine argue that study policy complexity is that we need these policies. They are a signal of modernization, of trying to solve problems. And then there are different ways of measuring complexity, and I argue that complexity comes through these interdependencies, but others argue that the longer a policy text, the more difficult it is, or the more different policy instruments exist, the more complexities exist. But what all these authors have in common is to argue that we do need these policies in the process of modernization. But we also have to make sure that complexity has a level that is manageable, of course, because these policies need to be implemented, and if implementation becomes impossible because of complexities, then this is a real problem. And how to make it? No, not starting from scratch, but certainly reforming. And here, I have tried to argue that reforms also take lots of resources and time. Can we start with some reforms that are particularly effective? So this was the idea of these SDGs. If we know about these multipliers, then we can start with reforms where they are most effective.
Okay, one last question maybe.
Thank you. What if complexity is not the problem, but the time it takes for the governments to quit the policies and to start with new ones? It takes too much time, probably, especially for the climate crisis.
A very good point. I mean, the last IPCC report was talking about a closing window of opportunity, so time matters, and policy reforms often take 10 years or so, and then we have just reformed one policy, but as I just told you, there are so many. So time is definitely a factor, which is why I try to study policies over time. I will think about this a bit more. Maybe you should theorize this better. What is the effect of time? Is there a trade-off? Yeah, it's a good input.
Florence, you really like theories and you like to theorize.
Yeah.
When the Green Hub came up with your name, I Googled you and I saw that you did your PhD by dancing it. It was about water policy, but you were dancing for about 8 minutes. Your PhD with words on the movie, so you could see what it was about, but you were dancing hip-hop, salsa, house music. If I asked you to dance this information you gave to us tonight, what kind of dance would you show us?
Yeah, I think it would have been a bit similar to what I've been dancing in. So there is a Science magazine. Science magazine is one of the biggest, most famous publisher magazines, and it has the so-called Dance Your PhD contest. It is every year happening, and people dance their PhD in the area of biology, physics, chemistry, and social sciences. And in the year where I graduated from my PhD, I decided to participate. I thought that this was just fun, and it was just fun for fun, but if I look at my publications, they sometimes take 10 years or 5 years to work on this, and this was just a very quick video, but the visibility this video has been clicked on many times and has been watched many times, whereas my articles are not so famous, unfortunately. But this video, the nice thing about it is it forced me to really boil down the message of my work to something, to one message. And one of the core things I actually did not explain this at all, but what I study is political actors and what they want and how they what are the political fights of power, and how I look then at this transition phases is a bit like this in coalitions. So, and this is also what I danced in this video. You're welcome to look at this, but
look it up on YouTube.
What you see is in this video is that there is in our societies there's different interests. So there is environmental interests and there's economic interests, etc. And they fight over political powers. And because not single actors don't have enough political power on their own, they create groups. And together they then try to lobby for their interests. And so what I argue is that in these transition phases, what we observe is that groups that are in power in the past, they will be less powerful in the future, because this is otherwise. So only if new groups become in power, there's policy change, and this is very much what I've been dancing. And I think I would also dance this to explain what is happening in these transition phases today. that new paradigms like sustainability, they will only come about if there's new groups gaining power.
So maybe you would have suggested a group dance, all the public dancing with you together here on stage.
Yeah, and then we will see, you know, they will be interests formed. Some prefer to dance salsa, some prefer to dance, I don't know, are there some dancing interests? You know, different people like to dance different dance styles, and maybe the dance style that reaches the majority then will have most impact.
Okay, well, I think that's a beautiful ending of this evening and of your lecture. I was very surprised to learn about all those theories behind the policies, and I thank you very much for it. Please, a warm applause for Florence Metz.